Now, due to time, we have to return to the next speech. Okay, let me see. Good morning, Professor Raudenbush.
Good morning.
Good evening. I'm sorry. Good evening.
Well, good morning to you.
Nice to meet you again.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. Good morning, Professor Chu and Dr. Xue. Okay, I see you, Dr. Xue. And
hi, very glad to meet you, Professor Raudenbush.
Good to see you.
Okay.
Nice to meet you, Professor Raudenbush.
Nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay. Now let me introduce you to the audience. We are very, very honored to have Professor Stephen Raudenbush as our keynote speakers. Professor Raudenbush is the Lewis-Sebring Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology and Chairman of the Committee on Education at the University of Chicago. He is also a member of the National Academy of Science and American Academy of Arts and Science. I think even in China, every student has read his books and papers on hierarchical linear models. Yes, the HLM. Yeah, I think if you are interested in quantitative methods, you will read this book. So she is really an academic superstar. So today, his speech topic is the design of randomized field trials in education. And this lecture's discussants are Professor Weihua Qiu, the Associate Professor at Department of Educational Management, East China Normal University, and Yuankang Xue, PhD candidates at ECNU, Department of Educational Management. Okay, let's welcome Professor Raudenbush to begin your speech.
Thanks so much for this introduction, and I want to thank President Hu Yaozong and Professor Shuang-Ye Chen for the opportunity to be on the Academic Advisory Committee of the Education Economics Laboratory at East China Normal University. I'm tremendously excited about this laboratory. It seems that through the laboratory, East China Normal University will be able to make many contributions to education, not only in China, but throughout the world. And being on that board has influenced my topic for today. But I begin with the idea that a society that seeks common prosperity for all must confront barriers to educational opportunity. And this requires not only resources, but knowledge about how to use those resources to make a difference in the lives of children. Now, many people think that they're experts about how to improve schools. Why? Because all of us have been in school. Businessmen think schools should be run like a business. Military leaders think schools should be run like an army. And psychiatrists think that schools should be run like a mental health facility. And old people, I don't want to say anything negative about old people, but old people think that schools should be run the way they used to be run back in the good old days. So people think they know, a lot of people think they know what should happen in schools, but in reality, there's great controversy and too little evidence about how to enable schools to bring learning opportunities to children of all backgrounds. And so there's a major role for experimentation, learning about schooling by evaluating attempts to change schools, learning systematically and rigorously from practice. And this requires a joint effort across the social science disciplines. And it requires strong partnerships with policymakers and practitioners who together can create a culture of experimentation and learning about how to promote learning. And that's why my topic for today is experimentation in education. And my theme is that experimentation in education has many similarities, but many differences from experimentation in other domains, such as agriculture and medicine. And yet what we've learned is that experimentation can be done on a large scale and can provide many insights about the improvement of education. So let me see if I can share this screen. That's not it. Sorry. Wait a minute. I'm sorry, this just take me a second here to find my overheads. Okay, one moment here. Let's see. Okay, this is a problem. Can't seem to find my overheads view. Let's see. Sorry, excuse me one moment. Okay, now I think I've got it. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know why this isn't working. Having a little trouble here.
Do you try to share the screen?
Yeah, here it is right here. But I don't know why it's. A second here.
Okay, take time.
There we go. There we go. There it is. All right, my apologies.
Great, it's coming. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Now I want to see if I can get my slideshow going. Oops. Okay, here we go. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. All right, so let me just say a little bit of background on educational experimentation. So the history goes way back. It goes back at least to 1927 in agriculture, where Sir R.A. Fisher, among others, taught us that if we randomly assign plots of land to fertilizers, we can make tremendous gains in learning about how to increase agricultural productivity. And within those plots, we can randomly assign types of seeds within the plots. So the analogy is the plots are schools and the seeds are the children. In medicine, the first widely known randomized trial occurred in the attempt to treat tuberculosis using a new drug called streptomycin. And that led to a cascade of more randomized trials, such that by 1962 in the United States, and by the way, the tuberculosis trial was in Great Britain, but by 1962 in the United States, our Food and Drug Administration required randomized efficacy trials for a wide variety of drugs and surgical procedures. So it really, randomized experimentation became institutionalized into the governance. But it wasn't until much later that people in the United States started to think about the large-scale use of randomized trials. And so a very influential study occurred in 1990 where in 79 schools, classrooms were assigned, teachers were assigned at random to a large and small, or a small class within the schools, and students were simultaneously assigned to classrooms. And this was an incredibly influential study in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this study. And so something parallel happened in education that happened in medicine. In 2002, Congress passed the Education Sciences Reform Act. Before 2002, there were very, very few large-scale randomized trials of education practices and policies. After 2002, hundreds of large-scale trials have been conducted. And I've been deeply involved in this, trying to figure out how to do these studies. And I find it to be a very exciting development. And I'm hoping that we can learn from each other with the new education lab and other experimental work going on in China. So here's the outline of the talk. First of all, I want to say, why do we want to do random assignment? And then secondly, I'm going to just briefly look at that 1946 study, the study of treating tuberculosis in medicine. And that's going to illustrate the power of random assignment, but it's also going to raise some questions. The questions are randomized trials possible in education? Is it feasible? And is it even ethical to do large-scale randomized trials in education? Before 2002, many of my colleagues in education were against randomized trials and thought they were not ethical and not even feasible or possible. But what we're going to see is that they are. It's possible to do a large number of randomized trials and to create what I'm going to call a culture of experimentation. And the key is understanding multi-level designs for education, for educational improvement. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. I think the wonderful talk about abracadabra mentioned the Success for All, Improving Reading Skill in 2007. I'll say something about the National Head Start study, and I'll say a little bit more about the Tennessee class size study. That's the study where we looked to see whether reducing class sizes in 1990 would have an effect. And these are 3, these are going to illustrate 3 of the major multi-level designs that really make experimentation possible in education. I'll say a little bit about sample size and cost, a little bit about the challenges. I'll just cover some of them. I'm not going to go into great detail because there's a big research agenda here for a lot of you young people who want to get involved in methodological research. There's a lot of challenges to valid inference that we need to really take on. And then I want to conclude by saying a little bit about using experiments to improve policy. So first question is, why random assignment? And a nice example of that is the 1969 evaluation of a new program at that time called Head Start. I don't know if you've heard of Head Start. Head Start is a preschool education program for poor kids in the United States. And so it was a very popular program, rolled out in the 60s. But the government and a lot of critics said, we should evaluate this program. Is it really working? And so we were looking at the relationship between participating in Head Start, just say a 1 if it's a yes, it's the treatment, yes, or no, 0 is no, and looking at the language development of children. And one of the interesting findings was at the end of the study, the children who were in Head Start scored about the same as the children who were not in Head Start. And does that mean the program was ineffective? Because a lot of people said, particularly very conservative people who didn't like the legislation in favor of Head Start said, this shows you it doesn't work. These kids are not, it's not possible to make great gains with these kids. Very nasty things people said about the kids. But we need to think about, this was a non-randomized study, and we need to think about confounding variable. So an obvious confounding variable in this study was student poverty. Head Start was designed for children who were from poor families. And the children in Head Start, on average, had lower income than the children in the control group. So there was a relationship, you see the arrow, between student poverty and participation in Head Start. It was a negative relationship. Student poverty also predicts the language outcome. So student poverty is a confounding variable, meaning it simultaneously predicts selection into the Head Start and it predicts the outcome. And if you don't take it into account, you have a biased study. In this case, it would be biased against Head Start because the children in Head Start are low-income kids. So actually, in the initial study, they did take some effort to control for student poverty, but there's a bigger problem. Student poverty is something that we could measure and control for in this study. Let's call something that we can measure and control for an observed confounder, something that we can measure. And we can adjust for that. And controlling for that, we can examine the relationship between Head Start and the outcome, controlling for X. The problem is U. U is one or more, maybe many more unobserved confounders. These are variables that predict participation in Head Start that also predict the outcome, but we didn't observe those variables. And so what's the main thing about a randomized study is that within the limits of chance, and I'm going to say more about that, within the limits of chance, random assignment to Head Start would, as happened in a later study that I'm going to tell you about, would remove not only confounding by observed confounders, but by unobserved confounders that no one even thought about. And that's the power of that's the key power of random assignment. And I'll give you an example. And the example is the study that I mentioned, the first study that was regarded as a large-scale randomized field trial in medicine, 1946. You can debate that. Going back to Germany in 1835, there were some studies that looked pretty much like a randomized trial. But in the literature, in the British Medical Journal, this is reported. And the way it worked was this new drug, streptomycin, was going to be tested, and patients were randomly assigned to be in the experimental group receiving the drug, and there were 55 patients. Or they were randomly assigned to being in the control, there were 52. And after waiting a certain amount of time, I can't remember whether it was 5 years or how long it was, in the experimental group, there were 4 deaths out of 55, whoops, I think I have it wrong. I think it was 4 out of 52. Sorry about that, I might have the numbers wrong. But there were 15 deaths in the control group. And when you do the statistical analysis, you come up with this thing called a p-value. I want to say what that is, probability 0.0035. In a normal study, what we would say is that the chances that these two groups could have such different death rates, if there was no difference between the means, the population means of the two groups, the chances are 3.5 out of 1,000. But because of randomization, we can say something stronger, okay? What we can say is that if there were no causal relationship between streptomycin and tuberculosis, the chances of seeing this difference in death rates that we observed would be 3.5 out of 1,000. In other words, with random assignment, our p-values that we use to model our uncertainty are telling us about the uncertainty with relationship to a causal effect, not just mean differences, because mean differences can be interpreted in different ways. But if you have randomization, it's causal. So that's a tremendous advantage of having a randomized study. The question, though, arises as to whether you could realistically expect to do that kind of a study in schools, because a lot of innovations in schools don't work on individuals within a school. They work on groups. They work on the entire school or the entire classroom. A new curriculum is designed to improve learning in a whole school, if the whole school adopts a new curriculum. So randomly assigning individuals within that school, you can't test a curriculum that way. So you can't do exactly what they did in the tuberculosis study. And teachers and teacher training, but let's just say teachers, they affect everybody in their classroom. And the success of a new curriculum depends on the teacher. So if you give teacher training to some teachers and not others, the effect of teacher training is mediated or comes about through the skill and knowledge of the individual teacher, and there are many teachers. So there's many versions of the treatment, okay? There's as many versions of the treatment as there are teachers, because teachers vary in skill, and teachers have what we call autonomy, meaning in our country, they have an enormous amount of autonomy. They can do a lot behind the closed door of the classroom. They can use different methods. And I think in any society, teachers have some degree of autonomy, okay? And so those make things complicated in terms of having a randomized trial. So how are we going to deal with this? Does this mean we can't do a randomized trial? I meant to mention also, the other thing that makes this different is that, see, in the streptomycin study, we didn't expect one patient to affect the other patient, right? One patient was randomized, another patient was randomized. It's not like they were unless they were husband and wife or they were family members, but that's not the way the experiments were set up. Those people were independent, but in a school setting, that's not the case. Children are in the same classroom, they influence each other. A classroom might have higher skill, making it easier to teach more advanced material. A classroom might have just one disruptive peer, could make it harder to teach unless you can cope well with that child. And so the answer seems to be, we have to do experiments in a different way. And they have to have a multi-level character. So the first kind of multi-level design I want to mention is the group random assignment. And the second kind is a multi-site random assignment where we randomly assign within sites. And that's more like the tuberculosis experiment, but I can explain how that actually works in education. And the third design, which turns out to be the most frequently used design in the United States and hundreds of these trials, is what I'm going to call, it's a mouthful, right? A multi-site group randomized trial. The groups are assigned within sites. And we'll use an example where classrooms are assigned at random within schools, and teachers are doing different things within the same school. The multi-site trial. Another example would be schools are randomly assigned within multiple districts. That's, in HLM terms, that's a 3-level model, because you've got kids within schools, within districts. So that number 3 is a 3-level model. So here's an example of school randomization, Success for All 2007. This is a whole school reading intervention where students are assessed, grouped, taught, reassessed, regrouped, and retaught. It's an interesting design. Robert Slavin, the late Robert Slavin, who I think was well known in China, was a key architect of this. Jeff Borman was a key leader in this study. What we have here is that we assign the schools at random, okay? So school 1 through school 18 are in the experimental group, and there's a total of about 1,085 kids in these 18 schools. Whereas in the control group, I actually think it ended up being, they started with 18, it ended up being 17 schools are in the control group. So it's a two-level structure because the students are nested within the schools, but the schools are randomly assigned. And I'm going to say a little bit about, and this came up in the Abracadabra, very excellent talk that I listened to earlier, school randomization. And that we have to think about the numbers of schools we have to recruit, as well as the numbers of people. And what Borman and Slavin and others found was a large effect size, 0.36 of a standard deviation. And then the prior talk, it was about maybe 4 months of growth between the two groups, and a very low probability that you would see such a result if there were no causal effect. Whoops, forget about the variance. That's a mistake. Okay. Now, in a multi-site trial, now here's the second kind, which is I'm going to call a multi-site randomized trial. This is the National Head Start Impact Study. And this is an amazing study because from a population of 1,258 Head Start centers, 378 were drawn at random. And then the way the randomization works was that these were very popular programs, and lots of people wanted to have their kids in these Head Start programs, and there weren't enough spaces. So a large number of people applied, and there was a randomized lottery to see which people would get in. So you win the lottery, you get assigned a chance to go to Head Start. You lose the lottery, you're not assigned to go to Head Start. And so using that method, even though Head Start works on the whole school, right? Everybody in the school gets Head Start or not. We have individual level random assignment. And the beauty of it is, let me just say, so here's kind of just so you make sure this is clear. So we have the 1258 Head Start centers randomly assigned. From that, we get a sample of 378. And then within each center, you see it's different from school randomization because within each center, the children are assigned to an experimental or a control group. So it's still a two-level structure. Children are within centers. But the key point is that the assignment and the treatment is administered within schools. And this creates a very powerful situation, which is that we get out of this study a treatment effect for each and every center, which we didn't get with the school randomized trial. We just got one treatment effect because some schools were in the experimental group, some were in the control. Here, what we really have is a replicated randomized study. And the beauty of that is that these centers vary tremendously in their organizational settings, their resources, even their curricula were different. And within them, of course, the children served are different. There are some of them are in the big cities, in the very poor neighborhoods of big cities. Some of them are in the mountains of Appalachia, which is a very poor rural area. So they're all over the country. And so this gives us a chance to study the generalizability of the treatment across this wide variety of settings for this wide variety of children. And the result was an average treatment effect of 0.2 standard deviations, which is probably like maybe 2 to 3 months of learning, not a gigantic effect, but it was significant. But the key point here is that there was variance of the treatment effect. And this is crucial. So I'm going to show you a little slide here. This is a histogram of estimates of the site-specific treatment effects. And you can see 0.2 is sitting right in the middle. But you can see some sites had big effects up to 0.4, which is double the effect. And that's something like maybe 4 to 5 months of learning. But in some sites, there was virtually no effect. And in the few, there was a very high effect. So what this means is there's tremendous heterogeneity in the impact of this study. And that opens up, and that's a generalizability question. So under what conditions and for which children is this actually going to be effective? And so that from a multi-site trial, and by the way, in the old days, the experimentalists called it a randomized block design because you have multiple blocks, randomization within block. You have the opportunity of studying in a beautiful way the heterogeneity of the treatment effect without using any covariates. We're not saying, did boys get better results than girls or girls better than boys or black kids better than white? We're not, you can do that too. That's important. But there when you do the generalizability, you're using a priori characteristics of kids. Here, you're just using randomization. And for you guys who know a little bit about statistics, these are what we call empirical Bayes estimates. So these correct for measurement error. The distribution of these is actually probably a little bit smaller than the actual distribution because the ones that are unreliable, we're pulling them toward the center. So where you want to capitalize here on measurement error, we're adjusting for measurement error. So this is a somewhat conservative picture of how variable the treatment effects were. So tremendous heterogeneity. And you know that one number, just the average of treatment effect, does not adequately describe what's going on. And this is one of the biggest problems in a lot of our randomized trial. We walk away with one number. What's the average treatment effect? And look at the heterogeneity. And we see that because we have a multi-site randomized trial. And then the third kind of design I want to talk about is the multi-site group randomized trial. So here we have group randomization, but we have the groups are nested within sites. So the Tennessee class size study is an example where the teachers are assigned and the classrooms effectively are assigned within schools. It's really the teachers being assigned to a large or a small class, right? Because we want to see whether small classes work better. And the kids are randomly assigned to the classes. And so here's a picture of sort of how that goes. So there were 79 schools. So each school has an experiment, but the experimental units are classrooms. So there's a set of experimental classrooms. Within each classroom, there's students. Set of controls classrooms within each classroom are students. And that's true for each school, number 1, all the way up to number 79. So we call it a 3-level model because the students are nested within the classrooms, and the classrooms are in either the experimental control within the school. So you have students within classrooms within schools. The treatment assignment is at level 2. It's at the classroom level. Everybody in the same classroom has the same value of the treatment variable. But because we have 79 replicated experiments, we also have the opportunity to study the heterogeneity of the treatment effect. So here's the histogram for this very famous study. The average effect size was pretty much like what it was actually in the Head Start study, which this one happened first, but still. So about 0.18, but look at the tremendous heterogeneity. So what this raises, this question is, teachers probably vary a lot in their skill in using a small class. So this is let me make clear, 0.18 is the average effect of being in a smaller class rather than a bigger class. By the way, a smaller class was 16 to 18 students. A bigger class was more like 28 students, okay? And on average, kids benefited from being in a smaller class, on average. But there was huge heterogeneity. And we need to study that. We need to understand that. How did that happen? There's lots of hypotheses, but one obvious hypothesis is that teachers use small classes differently. You can imagine, I have a big class, I give a lecture, right? I have a small class, I still just give the same lecture. That's not going to make any difference. So there is a really interesting question about why these treatment effects vary. And having the multi-site nature of this group randomized trial, that's how we see the heterogeneity. And it opens so many questions for research that you wouldn't see if you didn't have that kind of design. Okay, so let me say a little bit about, actually, even though I got screwed up at the beginning, we're not doing too bad for time as far as I can see. I think we're going to be all right. It'll say a little bit about sample size. In the Success for All study, there were 35 schools assigned at random. And it turns out that when the schools are the unit of randomization, the number of schools is very influential about how much statistical power you're going to have to detect an effect. It's more important actually than the number of kids per school. More is better, but there's a limit to how much you gain by having more kids in each school, or more classrooms in each school, actually. Is what the issue here. There weren't very many classrooms per school. So here's a graph. I want to show you the power curve. So this is the number of clusters. This is the number of schools. And this lower bar is, and by the way, we're assuming, and this is more, I should say, this is more for the success for all type study. This is really for success for all, not for the class size study, because that was a 3-level. This, I'm trying to keep it simple. This is a 2-level study. Okay, so in success for all, if you had, and they had about 60 kids per school in success for all. They used the significance level of 0.05. And if you were shooting for a treatment effect of about 0.25, which is a little smaller than what they actually got, but that's what they were shooting for. And then, now here's the other fact. How much variation is there between schools? If schools vary a lot, you need more schools. Okay, if schools are very similar, you don't need as many. If they vary a lot, well, they do vary a lot here. So you need quite a few schools. So the lower curve is with no covariate. I'll talk about covariate in a minute. And you would need maybe 120 schools to have adequate statistical power of about 0.80. That's the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis, the probability of declaring a significant causal effect. If the true effect was 0.25, is going to be 0.80. That's going to be we're going to shoot for at least a 0.80, 80% probability. We would need 120 students, okay? Now, this other graph is so fascinating. And this is so for you people who were doing group randomized trials, here's what saves you, a covariate. They had a mean pretest score for each and every school. And the mean pretest score is very strongly related to the mean post-test score in reading. And having that covariate was effectively more than doubling the sample size. Just having that covariate, because it explains so much variation in the outcome, it increases our power. The amount of residual variation is so small that it gives us a small standard error. It gives us much more power. And they only needed in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 schools in order to have that 0.80 probability. So how you plan these studies is hugely important. I mean, imagine a study with 120 schools. It's just enormously expensive. Each school cost something like, they gave schools $30,000 to participate, and the school had to raise money itself. So that, the total is like $80,000 a school, and you've got 120, that's a gigantic amount of money. But if you use this covariate, interestingly enough, if you have it, and you often have it with educational achievement, you don't necessarily have it with other outcomes. So planning these studies becomes very important, and you need a hierarchical model that reflects the multi-level design. If it's a school randomized study, it's a 2-level model. Treatment is at level 2. If it's a multi-site trial, it's a 2-level model. Treatment is at level 1 at the school child level. If it's a multi-site cluster randomized trial, the treatment is at the middle level. And you've got to get these, and you've got to make guesses about how big the effect's going to be, how much of the variation lies between and within the different levels, right? And how powerful the covariate was. Here, the covariate had a correlation of 0.85 with the post-test. And aggregated covariates can be very powerful, okay? All right, so some challenges to valid inference. Non-compliance. People are assigned to a treatment, but they don't participate. Some people don't. Some do, some don't. That's called non-compliance. Or people are assigned to control and they do participate. Attrition. Some people can drop out at the end of the study, and some people just don't show up for one or more of the achievement tests or the outcome variables that are being collected. And generalizability. Usually experiments are based on volunteers, the volunteers, the volunteer schools, or they could be the principals who really want to make things better, and maybe they don't represent the general population. So in Head Start, of those assigned to Head Start, only 77 actually attended Head Start, and 23% didn't. Of those assigned to the control, interestingly enough, 11% of them found their way. They got into Head Start, even though they were assigned to the control, and 89% didn't. So we can use the random assignment as an instrumental variable. I got a bunch of references here at the end. I don't have time to go through all of the details of how this works. I don't think you want to hear all that right now. We want a big overview, right? Missing data. Even though 378 sites were sampled, there were only 317 sites that had complete data on outcomes. We can use some strategies, multiple imputation. I've got a little reference for that, or waiting for non-response. So we have to do some things to fix the randomized study that's sort of, in a sense, broken. And then generalizability. The best thing is if you can do, like in Head Start, randomly sample from a population, then within the sample, randomly assign groups. That way you know your schools, your centers represent the population. That's fantastic. It's very rare, very rare. Another alternative is meta-analysis. So if you have, if you replicate a study under different conditions and for different kinds of people, and you start seeing the same result, then you have generalizability. If you don't, you're hedging your generalizations. And that's what a multi-site trial really is. It's really a planned meta-analysis because you've got the treatment in each and every site. And this is a new idea that's kind of exciting, catching on. You can link your experiment to national survey data, and you can compute the propensity to be in this experiment if you have similar covariates in the two studies, and then you can reweight the population and estimate the treatment effect. Okay. We also need to talk about how to advance theory, and I am actually running out of time. Moderation. Questions about moderation come up, not just was there an effect, but who benefits and under what conditions. And again, the multi-site trial is very good for that. Mediation. How does the treatment produce an effect? Through what mechanism? Through increasing children's motivation, through getting them to work harder, in other words, through improving the instruction, the clarity of the presentation, for giving them more practice. Different mechanisms. And spillover. How does the impact of the treatment effect on one person affect others? So if you have a behavioral intervention and you've got that child who's having a little trouble and is a little disruptive, and you can fix that, maybe that's going to improve life for the other kids. That's what's called a spillover effect. Okay. All right. So to wrap up, using experiments to improve education. Good questions arise from practice, and ongoing discussion of findings with policymakers and practitioners seems to be the key to get people to use the results of experiments. An ongoing conversation where everybody evaluates the results and plans the next experiment. That gets everybody hooked, and you can get there's some good examples of that. To create a culture of experimentation, we're beginning to see that in some areas. People said it couldn't happen in education, it can. But you have to build on a strong foundation of educational research, because you need the large-scale surveys to tell us what the issues are. What are the problems we're trying to solve? What do we have to work on? And you need local qualitative research to incorporate perspectives of students and practitioners. So that's where a lot of the good questions come from, by having contact with people in the field, right? And then here's another thing I think that we really need to do, and I hope this is going to be a big thing that the education lab does in China, and that is being a spur to build more expertise in statistics and research design, because we need that to do. You see, the field of biostatistics came out of after World War II, when medical research became very popular with the randomized trial. And the same thing is beginning to happen with education experimentation, but that's an important issue. Here's the resource. I can hand out these things or send them out. All the references are here to what I said. They're all numbered, and here are all the references, and you can read all about it. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Raudenbush for giving us such a wonderful lecture. And it helps us get a clear understanding about what is randomized field trial and why it can generate credible evidence for educational improvement, and how to design a randomized trial in education. And I couldn't agree with you more about the value of experimentation in education, because we are now living in a digitized knowledge economy characterized by fast change, continuous innovation, and upgrading. We have more opportunity and better resources to carry out experiments in education. And the 3 case studies discussed in your lecture are very inspiring. These results show what a randomized field trial can achieve in basic education. While listening to your lecture, I'm thinking and wondering if it's possible to apply this new approach to study innovation in higher education, because I'm very much interested in innovation in higher education. Or would it be a little bit more complicated when such a approach is used in higher education? Because higher university professors have greater autonomy than high school teachers, and there is also a greater heterogeneity among colleges. And I have an interesting topic under my consideration. As you know, there is a new type of innovation called a micro-credential program, popularized by the MOOC revolution. A micro-credential program is a bunch of short courses, well-designed short courses, typically 5 to 7 courses, try to help learners build a specific skill in a specialized field. And they are micro-credential program about such as data mining or digital marketing, a micro-credential program for public health or global poverty. And the famous MOOC platform, Coursera company, provide more than 600 of micro-credential programs. It called it a specialization program. And driven by this idea, in recent 2 years, many universities in China begin to provide a micro-credential program for undergraduate students. And the Chinese name is Weizhuanye, which literally means micro specialization program. So I'd like to ask your advice. Do you think it is possible for us to use a randomized field trial to study these micro credential program to test its effectiveness? And how to judge an innovation program is suitable to be evaluated by randomized field trial or not? That is something puzzle me. So I'd like to.
That's a terrific question. Actually, I think that the digital learning, which is individualized with the child and the learner, I shouldn't say the child, we're talking about college students, the students and the machine, where it's individualized, is actually a great place for very precise kinds of experimentation, but it's a little bit different from what I'm talking about. And this is getting very exciting in what's called precision medicine. Okay, it's very similar. So what I mean is, you can have a stimulus, and the student can respond, and you can ask questions, and you can immediately evaluate the response of the student, and then you can use the student's response to decide what is going to be the next question. And now these are often called adaptive treatment regimes, because what you can do is you can set up a set of rules for assigning, like let's say I'm doing math, what should be the next question given the sequence of questions that I've been asked up to that time. Okay, and so you can then optimize the sequence of questions by, you can try different regimes. These are called, and Susan Murphy, who's at Harvard, has been within medicine, she's an old colleague of mine from Michigan. She's a genius. She's fantastic. She has really developed these in healthcare, what you would do is you would, like one set of rules would be, you ask harder and harder questions at a certain rate, or easier and easier. And you can try different regimes, and you can try to optimize the regime by trying different things, even in real time. Now, the problem with that, of course, is it's wonderful for mathematically and for studying, but it only applies to the individualized, learning one-on-one with the machine. And it's important, and we can do that. I mean, actually, that's a very good scenario for doing randomized trials. You can randomly assign people to different regimes, meaning different sets of rules for how you assign these questions. And you can do a lot of things with the machine. It's very easy to randomly assign individuals, with the machine. But so I think that's a very good area. But of course, a lot of what we do isn't going to be done that way. But there's another thing that we can do. We could try. Actually happened in Chicago at the high school level. I can send you a reference where there was kind of this machine interface, but there was a hypothesis that, at least for the kids in high school, it would work better if they were sitting in a room and the kids working on the machine were being facilitated by an adult learner, so that they were processing what they were learning, so that there was some collective learning going on. It wasn't just individualized. And they found that actually combining the machine with facilitated instruction, and they did a randomized trial, they found that worked actually better than simply having the kids with the machine alone. Now, these are high school kids, but we've had some interesting experiments in the third world with what's called distance education. We find the same thing, that watching something passively or just interacting with the machine is good, but it's probably better if there's somebody who helps you facilitate and make sense out of this and ask questions, somebody who can answer some questions. So of course it's making it more costly, which is moving away from one of the purposes of MOOC is to have very, very cheap, very, very inexpensive education. But those are two ways, I think, in which you could do that. And now the question about more broadly, we might have to use some other designs that are close to randomization. One of them is called a regression discontinuity design. So we could say that everybody who scores above a certain cut point or below is going to get a certain regime. And then we can do something that's almost like a randomized trial to see whether the assignment worked. Because a lot of things happen at the college level. Like at Chicago, everybody gets a math test, so they come in and then they get assigned to different levels. So this is already happening. So it's a natural experiment. You can do this. You don't have to, but you're not randomly assigning. So it's not quite as good as a randomized trial. So we can look for some better quasi experiments is another thing we can do.
Okay, thank you. These suggestions are very helpful. I'm very grateful to your advice. And I have a more general question about the randomized field trial. As you know, this approach can help us figure out whether an intervention program is effective or ineffective. But I want to know if randomized field trials can help us shed some light on the mechanism which enable that intervention to take effect. Is it possible to do so? Yeah, well,
that's a great question. And in labs, in laboratory experiments, psychologists do this. They try to figure out what are the mediators, and then they randomly assign people to the mediator. But mostly in these large field settings, at least today, the randomization to the intervention that solves the confounding problem, but the mediators are not assigned at random. And so we have to use specialized methods, and we have to make stronger assumptions typically about those mediators. And most of the research, one of the books that I've got a book on my list by Guanglei Hong, who's actually an ECNU grad, who's at Chicago. It's called Causality in a Social World. moderation, mediation, and spillover. So it's a focus on these questions. So I do want to recommend that book. And knowing that most of the mediation, mostly we're using non-experimental statistical adjustment through weighting or through some kind of stratification or some kind of covariance adjustment in order to estimate the effects of those mediators. So we have to make stronger assumptions, because unless we can figure out how to randomly assign you randomly assign people to the treatment, and then then you randomly assign people to the mediator. But that's hard to do, because a lot of the mediators are things that are hard to randomly assign. They're things that people do and choose to do, and so there's preferences and stuff. So it's more. I agree. It's much harder, but it's a cutting edge issue. It's an absolute cutting edge issue that we have to really cope with, because if you don't know the mechanism, you have a hard time scaling it up, because you don't know whether in the short run is it working. You can't necessarily wait 5 years to find out if the program's working, but if you have the mediators, then you can look and see whether the mediators are being affected by the program, right? And then you're on the right track. So having a theory with mediators is extremely important for scaling the intervention up. It's a theoretical question. I'm totally with you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. These are all my questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the great questions.
Thank you, Professor, for your enlightening lecture that helps us to understand this area. And I have a more general question for you. That is, after read some of the literature, I found that most of the research focusing on macro areas such as teaching method, teacher initiative, for example, the well-known Pay for Percentile program, others like the early childhood development. But I found that randomized field experiments are more like a remedy approach. That is to say, an intervention designed to verify its effectiveness, more like a post-intervention rather than pre-distribution. And this approach may be sometimes superficial to some extent, such as in the field of educational inequality study. We may be able to promote educational equity by increasing funding or grant for disadvantaged groups by random field experiments. But for some more deeper issues, such as how inequality is formed and how could we deal with income segregation, it may be difficult to study through a randomized field experiment. I wonder, what do you think about such a question?
Absolutely, I agree with you. And at the beginning, I was saying that there has to be a strong foundation of educational research with using different methodologies, large-scale survey research and qualitative methods, and panel studies over time, where entire systems are doing different things. But I think my sense is that we've had a lot of research on the structure of inequality, the causes of inequality, and the sustaining of inequality, but we haven't had enough on how to overcome it. So, there, in some ways, the idea of intervening and experimenting is trying to correct an imbalance in the literature where we had a vast number. I mean, in sociology, I can just show you hundreds of references of explaining stratification, unequal opportunity. How does it start? How does it develop over time? What are the outcomes of different people? And we've just been studying this for 100 years, and it's still with us. At some point we have to try to overcome it. But a lot of the interventions that we're going to try are going to be natural experiments. Policymakers are going to decide they want to do something like, what's the effect of abolishing the private tutoring? Is that going to increase inequality? Well, that can actually be studied, not by a random. Well, it could have been studied if you tried if you tried that policy in certain provinces but not others, you could do it. But given you have a time series, and you have to figure out some ways of getting a causal inference from a time series in a natural experiment. And that's still very important. And random assignment won't replace the importance of what might be called the natural experiment. I'll just mention one thing. We studied a program that doubled the instructional time for kids in algebra in the beginning of academic math in secondary school. We followed those kids all the way until college, and we found that doubling that time actually increased the probability that they would get a college degree. That was not a randomized experiment. We used a regression discontinuity design. So we need all the tools we can get but when we have a new program and we have to decide how to do the assignment, if we can do it randomly, we're better off.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for helping me to understand this question. I think that there are many tools for us to use, not limited to the random field experiments. And thank you. And Professor Chiu.
Thank you, Professor Raudenbush, for giving us such an inspiring lecture. And maybe in the future, we can invite you to design a micro-credential program about the randomized field trial in education. Maybe it can spread the idea of randomized field trial and inspire more people to participate in experimentation in education. Thank you very much, Professor.
And by the way, I don't know if you're connected with the East China Normal University, the new lab, but I'm on the advisory committee and I intend to have some engagement. And I hope that maybe a lot of you will participate in that, because to me, that's a very exciting development. I don't want to hog too much time.
I'm a faculty member at the Institute for Economics of Education. Yeah. And some of my colleagues are members of the lab that you mentioned. Yes.
Yes. I met some of them I was on sabbatical in China. I met a lot of those people, and I think China could make an ECNU could become a major center for educational experimentation. It would be fantastic.
Yes, that's what we are going to do. So will you have the chance come to ECNU next year? Maybe in the summer vacation?
Could be. I will probably come back at some point soon, and hopefully when you don't have to sit in a hotel for 2 weeks before you can see him. But yes.
Yes. Okay. Looking forward to meet you.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward also.
Very glad to meet you. Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.